because I think it must be engraved on our national memory. Thousands of government-sponsored experiments did take place at hospitals, universities, and military bases around our nation. The goal was to understand the effects of radiation exposure on the human body. While most of the tests were ethical by any standards, some were unethical, not only by today's standards, but by the standards of the time in which they were conducted. They failed both the test of our national values and the test of humanity. Informed consent means your doctor tells you the risk of the treatment you are about to undergo. In too many cases, informed consent was withheld. Americans were kept in the dark about the effects of what was being done to them. The deception extended beyond the test subjects themselves to encompass their families and the American people as a whole. For these experiments were kept secret, and they were shrouded not for a compelling reason of national security, but for the simple fear of embarrassment, and that was wrong. So today, on behalf of another generation of American leaders and another generation of American citizens, the United States of America offers a sincere apology to those of our citizens who were subjected to these experiments, to their families, and to their communities. When the government does wrong, we have a moral responsibility to admit it. The duty we owe to one another to tell the truth and to protect our fellow citizens from excesses like these is one we can never walk away from. Our government failed in that duty, and it offers an apology to the survivors and their families, and to all the American people who must be able to rely upon the United States to keep its word, to tell the truth, and to do the right thing.
Hey, what's up guys? Tyler here with Secure Team. A bombshell list of videos and film footage have recently been declassified by the US government, showing some of the most secretive nuclear tests that were conducted from the mid-1940s until their official end in 1962. According to a great new article from TheVerge.com, the United States conducted over 200 nuclear tests high in the atmosphere in order to learn about the power of nuclear weapons. These were very secretive and terrifying tests, and they were filmed from every possible angle and distance. There's an estimated 10,000 of these films that are believed to be in existence and stored in high security vaults scattered throughout our country. However, now for the first time, around 4,200 of these films have been scanned, and around 750 have been declassified by the US government. These short clips that you're watching here are a part of around 60 of these films that have actually just been released to YouTube. Compliments of a man named Greg Springs, who is a weapon physicist and who operates something called the Lawrence Liverpool National Laboratory, or LLNL. And so he has taken these recent declassified pieces of film footage and posted them online for us to see. And I'll put the link to this playlist down in the video description. But as you're seeing in these quite terrifying images here, and for those of you who maybe don't know much about it, in a nutshell, back between the 1940s and the 1960s, the government conducted hundreds of these secret tests where they would literally send nuclear bombs up into our atmosphere where they would then be detonated. And they did this under the guise of testing the effects of high-altitude nuclear blasts, which even to this day, we don't know much about. But what you will see in these tests really does give you a first-hand example of the lengths that the government would secretly, mind you, go to in using all of humanity as their guinea pigs to test terrifying things like this. It was a huge undertaking just for Mr. Spriggs to get his hands on these declassified films, having to fill out mountains of paperwork just to get one single film at a time, and all of the bureaucratic red tape that came along with it. And as I said earlier, this gives us yet another example into the very dark history of our government, or at least the US government, that is. The government has done some pretty horrific things in the past, and they still are, and I'm sure I don't have to tell most of you this if you've been following my channel for any extended period of time. The degree with which the government will go to carry out some of these things, some horrific things, right under the public's nose, is well documented. For instance, one of the, if not the most horrific of these tests that actually came to light, thankfully, after some documents were found, was that of something called MK Ultra. Now, for those of you who don't know, MK Ultra, or Project MK Ultra, was a secret project that had many sub-projects attached to it that occurred starting in the 1950s, where the US government began conducting illegal experiments on both US and Canadian military members, as well as everyday, ordinary American and Canadian citizens, regular people. And in many cases, these people were abducted off of the street and were then subjected to a list of different experiments, which included injecting them with drugs, sensory deprivation, torture, and really just a host of devious methods through which they were attempting to develop various mind control capabilities. The program specifically focused on breaking down and controlling the mind, and they would do this by using drugs such as LSD, hypnosis, as well as sexual abuse. Many of these experiments were done in secret without the consent of the people that they abducted, and many of the victims today still suffer with psychological problems, amnesia, brain damage, and even death. The entire MK Ultra program was coordinated by the CIA in conjunction with the US Army's Chemical Corps. Now here's the scary thing about MK Ultra. The scope of this project was extremely broad, with research being undertaken at over 80 institutions, including 44 colleges and universities, as well as hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies. The CIA operated through these institutions using front organizations, and as the US Supreme Court later noted, MK Ultra was concerned with, quote, the research and development of chemical, biological, and radiological materials capable of employment in clandestine operations to control human behavior. The program consisted of some 149 sub-projects contracted out to various universities, research foundations, and similar institutions. At least 80 institutions and 185 private researchers participated. Because the agency funded MK Ultra indirectly, many of the participating individuals were unaware of what exactly they were participating in. Now, nobody would have ever known that Project MK Ultra ever existed had it not been for a special committee appointed by the president back in 1975, whose goal was to investigate the CIA activities within the United States. And it turns out that then CIA Director Richard Helms had ordered all of the secret MK Ultra files to be destroyed in 1973. However, later on, it was found that just a few of these documents had survived this destruction order. And in 1977, a Freedom of Information Act request uncovered nearly 20,000 documents relating to Project MK Ultra, providing us with just how large a scope with which this project operated. So the program was publicly and, quote, officially halted in 1973. However, evidence has shown that this horrific government project has continued to today, with individuals coming out claiming to have been victims of these secret tests. We've also heard testimony from so-called super soldiers who were a part of a sub-project of MK Ultra program called Project Monarch. Project Monarch also dealt with mind control, which consisted of gaining this control over single individuals, using trauma and torture in order to fragment their minds and thus to split their personalities repeatedly so that they could be triggered later and used for assassinations and what have you. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Manchurian Candidate, works by the exact same principle. Now, there are even a couple great films that are based off of the MKUltra program. One of them is called The Killing Room, which is a great film that came out a few years ago, and there's another one called The Banshee Chapter, which is also largely based around the MKUltra program. I highly suggest watching both of these films, The Killing Room and The Banshee Chapter, and it'll give you some insight as to what happened then. But as I said, the government has operated many of these secret programs and tests. MKUltra is just one of them. And I'm going to be doing future videos on some of these other projects, things such as Project Stargate, which was the code name for the secret U.S. Army unit established back in the late 70s that involved psychics and remote viewing, which was then to be used for a military advantage. I've spoken about a man by the name of Ingo Swann in the past, who was a part of the Stargate project and one of the most well-known remote viewers on this planet. He is the man who is able to remote view the dark side of the moon and confirm alien bases on its surface, as well as visiting Jupiter and being able to sight things that were found around Jupiter that weren't discovered by scientists and astronomers for decades later. We're also going to talk about something called Project Pegasus and the so-called CIA jump rooms, where it is alleged that starting in the 1970s and leading up through the 80s, the CIA recruited people for involvement in a highly secretive teleportation technology, where it's alleged that they would actually use these rooms to teleport to planet Mars. A man named Andrew Bishago claims to have been one of the people who participated in this project from 1980 to 1984, using this CIA jump room to teleport not only to Mars, but also back to the 1800s, on one occasion finding himself at the famous Gettysburg Address, where on November 19, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln spoke to a crowd, and as you're seeing in this image here, Mr. Bishago claims that this young boy here is him, having been captured in this single photograph, curiously looking around at the crowd. And there's plenty more that we'll talk about as well. So, again, be sure to head over to this playlist of secret nuclear tests. They really are mind-blowing, literally, and terrifying at the same time. So, big thanks to Mr. Greg Spriggs for the work he's doing in restoring these very telling pieces of footage. So thank you guys for stopping by. Be sure to like and share this video on your way out, and I will see you all back here in just a bit.